We're going to do a walkthrough of a typical question where we need to identify the inputs, processes and outputs for an algorithm. So in this instance, we've got two students running a charity bake sale. They made 3 types of cake, and these are the prices: chocolate brownies at £1, Victoria sponge £2 and Swiss roll £3. Customers can buy any number of whole cakes, so you can't buy half a cake for 50p. So we need to break that problem down into different steps, and then we need to go on and build some pseudocode and then build some Python. The first problem we need to solve is finding out which cakes and how many of each cake does the person want to buy. So we need to ask them, how many chocolate brownies do you want? How many Victoria sponge do you want? How many Swiss roll do you want? And then we can work out what it's all going to cost. So to do that, I'm just going to write it in different steps. So I'm going to ask the user how many chocolate brownies. I'm going to wait for their answer, and when they give me their answer, I'm going to store it in a variable. And just for now, I'm going to call it number of brownies. What I'm going to do after that is almost exactly the same thing, except I'm going to ask them how many sponges they want. So I'm going to ask them, how many Victoria sponges do you want? Wait for their answer, and then store that in another variable. Remember, each number has to be stored in a different variable. And we've made the restriction that they can only have whole cakes. So that number that we store in number of brownies, or number of sponges, or number of Swiss rolls is going to be an integer. Looking back at the prices, we can see that chocolate brownies are £1, Victoria sponge are £2 and Swiss roll are £3. So if somebody bought 10 Victoria sponges, then it'd cost £20, because I'd multiply the 2 by however many Victoria sponges they got. And if they bought 1 chocolate brownie as well, I'd add on £1 for that, and if they had 2 Swiss rolls, it'd be 2 times 3. And then you'd add them all together. So I'm going to write that out as a calculation and store the answer in a new variable. What we're going to add in now is the calculation here. So we're going to calculate what the total cost is. And how we're going to do that is we're going to take the number of brownies here, so what they type in as how many brownies they want, and we're going to multiply that by 1. And you can see that's all in brackets. And then we're going to add that to the number of brownies, the number of sponges multiplied by 2. That £2 was the price of the sponges, the Victoria sponges. And then we're going to add that to the number of Swiss rolls times 3. And store that all in a variable called total cost. And the very last thing we need to do is tell the person what that total cost is. Looking at the problem here, you can see that I can kind of represent these as 3 different inputs here. I'm going to input the number of brownies, num sponges, num Swiss, and then I'm going to calculate, so that's a process, I'm going to calculate the total cost, and then I'm going to output total cost. So I've kind of broken it down. I'm now going to write that as pseudocode. Here it is in pseudocode, so write this out. Instead of saying ask how many chocolate brownies, what I want to do is I want to output on the screen, in speech marks, how many chocolate brownies. So that's what I'm going to output, the message for the person. So rather than saying I'm going to ask them, I'm going to output it on the screen. And then waiting for their answer and then storing it in a variable. So I'm going to wait for their user input and wait for the user to input something, and when they do, whatever they put in, I'm going to put it in num brownies. So I've taken number of brownies and I've just made a suitable variable name called num brownies. And I'm going to do the same for how many Victoria sponge and how many Swiss rolls, and each time store it in a different variable. Then for calculating, it's almost exactly the same. So calculate, and for pseudocode, you'll see that all the sort of command words like output, input, calculate and so on, they're all in capitals. Okay, so I'm going to calculate and then it says what I'm going to calculate. And then finally, what am I going to put on the screen? I'm going to output what the total cost is. So that finishes with output total cost. Now I've put down the right hand side what the flowchart is as well. So input, 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 calculate, output. But you don't need to do that bit if you don't have time. The next question asks us to identify what the inputs, processes and outputs are. So looking at this, it's quite easy to see from the flowchart that I've got 3 inputs: num brownies, num sponge and num Swiss. And then the process, that what am I doing with that data? So what I'm doing with that data is I'm calculating this equation. So that equation, calculating total cost, is the process that I'm doing with the data. And what are the outputs? There is only one output. The only thing I want to output on the screen is what the total cost is. The next question is, are there any repeated steps? And if you look at it, we're kind of doing the same thing 3 times here. We're asking a slightly different question, but we're kind of doing the same thing. So that's kind of repeated steps. There might be a way we can save on our coding, especially if it was more than 3 things, if it was 100 things, rather than asking 100 separate questions. Maybe there's some sort of loop we could put in. So yes, asking for the number of cake and storing the answer, that's the repeated step. And now what we're going to do is we're going to code it in Python. Now what I'm going to do is I am going to let you have a go at coding it in Python yourself, and then in a separate lesson you will get the answer. But what I want you to do is try to code this yourself, because you have this pseudocode here, and you should be able to write a program based on that pseudocode in Python.